Hi there, I'm Maddie Savage. Welcome back to the live stream from the Viaplay studio here at Nordic Business Forum 2019 in Helsinki. Welcome to those of you joining us on the live stream, and welcome to all of you joining us during the break from the main stage. We have got three fantastic speakers lined up for you for this session, all of them main stage speakers. So stand by for you to meet Kostas Markides, professor at London Business School, Alexander Osterwalder, he's the co-founder of Strategyzer, a top innovation company. But first, with us now, we have a global leader in giving strategic advice, best-selling author, huge traveler, Parag Khanna. Welcome to the Viaplay studio.
Thank you very much.
You have already made a strong appearance on the main stage. We were just saying, getting loads of tweets in Finnish. Not quite sure what people are saying, but I think the crowd can probably tell us people are happy and inspired. But for anyone that missed your talk, just give us a breakdown of the key points you were raising there.
Well, I wanted to emphasize, first and foremost, that Europe and Asia share this landmass known as Eurasia. We here in Europe cannot talk about Asia anymore as if it is some far-off, distant region that doesn't affect us, that we can't influence, that that we are detached from. Because if you look at the trade patterns between Europe and Asia, it's already the largest axis of trade in the entire world, right? So Europe is deeply connected to Asia, and it's going to become ever more so through all the infrastructure linkages like Belt and Road and so forth. So I wanted people to understand Asia as being much closer than we think, and much bigger even than we already think it is, because it's much more than just China. China is only 1.4 out of 5 billion Asians.
Okay, great summary. And your book, The Future is Asian, going into more detail on that topic as well. I want to talk a little bit about a few different things, starting with the ongoing trade war between China and the US. What are your thoughts on this? Where do you think we're going in, say, 5 years' time from now?
I've got a two-word answer for you. I call it permanent substitution. You know, what China is seeking to do is to permanently substitute its dependence on any American suppliers of goods, components, technologies, software with its own. Because anything that it gets from the United States can now be politicized, can be suspended, there can be export controls initiated on those things. We've just seen it happen today again. We saw it earlier this year with ZTE, for example, the handset company that also makes communications technology. So that company suffered tremendously as a result of the export control ban or export controls imposed by the United States. Now we've seen it with software companies, AI companies. Literally today, the U.S. has come up with new regulations banning certain components, chips, and so forth, and platforms to be sold to Chinese AI companies. That is very negative for them as well. So they are aspiring to total independence, really, from U.S. dependence.
So an ongoing power struggle. You can't see anything shifting, if not getting,
No, in terms of trade volume, let's remember that the trade between the United States and China has fallen drastically. China now trades more with Southeast Asia, a bunch of poor countries, than it does with the United States. So this is not really about trade. Trade is fungible. Trade is substitutable. If you don't buy something from one place, you can get it from somewhere else. That applies to almost everything, even high-tech goods like semiconductors. So this is really about technological superiority, which is not America's alone. It's also Japanese, it's European, it's a global competition. And then it's about the competition for markets, export markets, trade destinations. And there you can see the rest of the world having a choice. Am I going to go with Chinese technology, European technology, and American technology? And how can I acquire that technology in a way that doesn't lock me into that system? Because most countries don't want to belong to someone else's sphere of influence, right? They just want to have the best stuff. And that's the tension that's being navigated right now.
Okay, let's talk about one of those, not countries, but continents, Africa, where we're increasingly seeing China investing in places where European and American companies might otherwise have had influence in the past. But at the same time, we know that China is not as focused on sustainability as particularly European countries are. So how worried should we be about China's power, really, when it comes to investment in Africa?
I would step back. If you want to understand Africa, first understand Africa, not what China is doing in Africa or what Europe used to do in Africa. The fact is that Africa today is a continent of 50-something countries, more than 1 billion people, but it is very resource stressed. Even though it has some of the most arable land of any continent in the world, it underproduces in agriculture, but it is increasingly facing droughts and water scarcity. So climate change is a big factor. It has enormous amount of corruption, obviously, and violent conflicts going on. In a way, the rise of Asia, and Asia as a set of countries that consumes African commodities, is the best thing that's happened to Africa in centuries, right? So the rise of China, rise of India as a new trade partner is a great thing, has been a great thing for Africa, but it's obviously not enough. Even all the exports to Asia and all the investment from Asia is not enough to help Africa fix itself, right? So we really have to remember that. You know, I'm come from a post-colonial country, and I study post-colonial countries, which is most of the countries in the world. And the fact is there are two kinds of post-colonial countries: those that still blame England and France for their problems, and those that have taken responsibility for themselves. And my worry about Africa is that it doesn't yet have its own sense of a development model. How do we take advantage of our commodities? How do we industrialize? How do we build good infrastructure? How do we educate our people, right? How do we be more sustainable? If you had a strategy, then you would say, okay, well, China's come in, this can be really good. How do we make the most of this? They want to build some railways for us. They want to pay us for our copper and aluminum and cobalt. Great. Let's make the most of it. That's the real failure. And I'm someone who just fundamentally believes that countries, continents have to take responsibility for themselves. So, you know, if you are in a situation where China is interested in your country, that should be a good thing if you're smart.
I mean, but playing the devil's advocate and the climate card, is there not a worry that China and other Asian countries that are perhaps a little bit less invested in tackling climate change are going to be destroying some of these scarce resources that you talked about?
Well, there's a lot of inefficiencies in resource extraction and extractive industries. It happens even in the most advanced countries in the world, even in Canada and Australia, which are two of the wealthiest countries in the world with enormous commodity sectors, aren't fully efficient. But that should be seen as a business opportunity to help African countries do what they need to do to harness their raw materials more sustainably. So rather than staying on the outside and saying, you know, China is doing all these terrible things, China has no human rights standards, China is, you know, tarnishing the environment, you should be saying, how can we help these African governments manage the investment from China better, right, and use better technology and make it more sustainable? That's a business opportunity, and it's the right thing to do. Standing on the sidelines will get you nowhere.
Okay, so more cooperation, more collaboration, which brings me to discussing different kinds of business cultures. So obviously with your knowledge of both Asian and Nordic economies, I just want to know a little bit about what you think the Nordics can learn about the way Asian economies work.
Well, you know, I explained a bit today about the kind of evolution of Asian economic management in the last 20 years since the Asian financial crisis, and it obviously has a lot to do with kind of, you could call it macro prudential measures, structural, you know, sort of policies to ensure that they maintain high surpluses, build their currency reserves, and all of these kinds of things. They also will maintain a very strong role for the state in the economy. Now, again, is that optimally efficient? No. Do state-owned enterprises work as well as private enterprise? Hardly. However, these countries have to think about maintaining employment, you know, having something of a redistributive system, picking key sectors where they're going to be strong and have an industrial base. And so they want to be, they are cautious and protective of themselves, and I think we have to understand that. So, you know, working with them to reform and to gradually privatize, you know, to bring in the latest technologies to improve their standards, that's the way to work incrementally with Asians. Don't assume that they're ever going to become like us, because they're not.
Yeah, well, that's a mistake I think a lot of people have done in the past.
It is true.
We're trying to move away from that kind of attitude now. Let's talk specifically about Hong Kong, another place that's, you know, very hot topic at the moment. There's a lot of political unrest and tension there. How should that affect how we here in the Nordics consider doing business or expanding?
I mean, you know, I think the Western business community has a lot of interests, a lot of financial interests in particular in Hong Kong. And it has tried to use it as a source of positive leverage to say, look, we really need Hong Kong to remain a fully independent, financial center governed by those international norms that we're accustomed to, because of course no one trusts Chinese, mainland financial regulatory standards, rightly so. And that has not yet been enough to, convince China that it should behave differently in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is a political issue for them, not an economic issue. China used to depend on capital inflows from Hong Kong, but obviously it doesn't as much anymore. China is rich, China is big, China is powerful. So we do have to appreciate that this is a very political matter, and economic leverage is not going to be the way to convince China to change.
Okay, so that's more on a geopolitical level. On a more individual level, if I'm an investor or I'm a business person, should I be going there on a business trip? Should I be considering putting money there?
I've been there 3 times in the last 2 months. It's not going to be physically unsafe for you, if you are a tourist or a business traveler or so forth. But I think you have to understand the broader, sort of trajectory of the composition of dominance in the Hong Kong economy. A lot of the Hong Kong elites and business figures are seeing the stock market go down, the real estate values go down, and they're cutting their losses. And they may be moving their money offshore, moving themselves offshore. And look, for better or worse, this is what China wants. It wants those that are independently minded and have accumulated private wealth there to leave, and then to buy those assets, buy the equities cheap, buy the real estate cheap, buy mainland Chinese people who will come in. And that's already more than 1 million mainland Chinese, 1 million that have come in the last 20 years. So the sinification, of Hong Kong has been going on for more than 2 decades already. Of course, many people just woke up to it in the last couple of months, but much like what you see with Chinese behavior in Tibet or Xinjiang, people woke up to, the tragic situations there around the time of the Beijing Olympics in 2008. But I spent months in Western China with those peoples, Tibetans and Uyghurs, in 2004, 2005, 2006, when I was traveling there. And this is not a new issue, I'm afraid. So, sometimes we enter a conversation not understanding, everything that's been happening. And in some of these cases, it's not a happy ending. It might be too late,
Yeah. Really important context, though, just to look a little bit beyond the headlines that we see on the TV regarding these kind of incidents there. So if you are looking to invest or grow in Asia, where are the best opportunities?
Well, I think it depends on what you're selling. Obviously, I emphasize today that Europe has the world's most livable cities, the most desirable lifestyle, the political systems of parliamentary democracy, the welfare states that emphasize equity of opportunity. In every way, Europe represents the highest standards of achievement in political, economic governance. That's something to be proud of, not insecure about. And so when I see Europeans look over at Asia and see this yellow peril, I find it really shocking and shows a stunning lack of confidence in your own systems, which are the best. And everywhere in Asia, including in China, people will say, of course you'd rather live in a European city with a European quality of life and clean air and walkability, and a diversity of industry and economy, right? In every possible way, Europe is better. So you should want to share and export and sell that model and those technologies, the streetcars and trams, the driverless cars, the recycling technologies, in every possible way, the innovations and advancements that you take for granted here in Europe around smart cities are desired in Asia, in China, in India, in Vietnam, everywhere. So to help Asia achieve its potential is really to help Asia become more like Europe. Not for the rest of the world to bow down to Asia. And, I emphasize this point over and over because I think some people may think that I'm sort of an Asian triumphalist, but I'm an American who grew up in America and Europe, and I'm a political scientist who looks at data, and for any person in the world, you're most, if you were blind and picking where you'd want to be based just on numbers, you'd want to be European, right?
Yeah.
So I think that we have to remember that.
And you're a fan of the Nordic brand. We can see this, and also grew up a little bit or close to the Nordics.
Well, yeah. I mean, I went to high school partially in Germany, but in northern Germany on the Danish border. So in my town, we had multiple Danish schools, and I used to go to Denmark all the time. And that started when I was 15. But even my German high school had an exchange with a high school in Malmö in Sweden. So I spent some time there, but I've traveled extensively in the north. I wrote chapters of a previous book about the Arctic, the thawing of the Arctic economy, the flourishing of the Arctic economy. And for that, I went up to Kirkenes, which is the northernmost town in Norway. Not that far, I guess you could say, from northern Finland. So I've spent a fair bit of time in the region, and obviously in political science and economics, we always admire the Nordic systems, and we treat them in a way as in a box, sort of sui generis and so special that they could never be copied or emulated. And that's the one thing that in my work I try to disabuse of. I say we can always learn. Everyone can learn from everyone else. Even if we're dissimilar ethnically, dissimilar politically, dissimilar in our wealth, you can always learn from what other people are doing. And in that sense, again, it's part of what the Nordics have to share with the world.
Very inspirational comments to wrap up our talk. Thanks very much for joining us. Author and strategist Parag Khanna, thanks very much to you. We'll let you step down from your seat and rearrange with our next guest.
Thank you.
Great to have you with us, though.
Thank you.
And great to see so many of you joining us here. Well, let's give him a round of applause, for sure. Good initiative there. And as Parag was mentioning, he's seen a lot of people tweeting in Finnish about his talk on the main stage. We do want people to share their thoughts using the hashtag MB4.